Welcome to Macro Hive Conversations with Bilal Hafiz. We aim to bring you the best in macro and markets thinking. To see our latest thoughts and analysis on the world, visit macrohive.com. 2021 has certainly started with a bang, and yet again, US politics is grabbing the headlines. But one of the things we pride ourselves at Macro Hive is that we prefer to cut through the noise and only focus on the things that matter for markets and investors. So while volumes have recently been written on President Trump and the recent violence in Capitol Hill, we've instead featured pieces on why inflation could stay low, the likely underperformance of small cap stocks, signs of strengths in the US labor market, and an academic deep dive into the origins of wealth inequality. I've also noticed that in our member Slack channel, people have been focusing on markets and actionable ideas rather than spouting their theories on the deep state or the end of democracy. And I hope we can keep that ethos going. So if you're not already a member of Macro Hive, I would urge you to sign up at macrohive.com. Your first month is free, and then it's only the cost of a few weekly cappuccinos, and you can cancel anytime. It's well worth it, and many call Macro Hive the hidden gem for investors. So please do sign up at macrohive.com. Now, on to our guest for this episode. I recently discovered Eli Dourado from a piece he published on which new technologies could be implemented this decade versus in the 2030s. I really liked the way he thought about this as he contextualized all the hype around new tech. As for Eli's background, he's an economist and a self-styled regulatory hacker living in Washington, D.C. He's a senior research fellow at the Center for Growth and Opportunity at Utah State University. Before that, he was the head of global policy at Boon, Supersonic. So, on to our conversation. So welcome, Eli, to the podcast. It's great to have you on. I have to say, I wasn't that familiar with your work until you wrote this excellent blog that came out a week or so ago called Notes on Technology in the 2020s. And I have to say, it's probably one of the best notes I've read on the different technological breakthroughs that we've seen and how likely they are to be implemented in society in the near term. So kudos to you for that.
Well, thank you. It's great to be with you and appreciate the kind words about the post.
Great. Before we jump into the topics that you discussed in that post, I always like to get a sense of the person's background who I'm speaking to. So you've had quite an interesting background, as it turns out, when I kind of delved into your biography. So perhaps you could tell me in your own words how you ended up where you are now and your path along the way.
Yeah, sure. So maybe start 15 years ago, I thought I wanted to be an economics professor. So of course, I started on a PhD and really enjoyed a lot of the coursework and the environment and so on. But along the way, I decided, no, this isn't really for me. I really would like to get off that track. And so I was fortunate to find a role at the Mercatus Center working on technology policy in 2012 on the tech policy team. And then when my boss left in 2014, I took over the team as the director of that program and sort of made a shift in sort of priorities to focus really on technology other than just information technology, which I think if you talk about technology policy in DC, like most people think like, oh, you're talking about like Facebook and Twitter and like Section 230 and stuff like that. And somehow there's this like really perverse idea that consumer technology is like the pinnacle of invention, which is, it's like apps. And so, I kind of started to focus our team more on real world stuff. And my own research was a lot on like drones and supersonics. And so that work on supersonics ended up leading to, I ended up taking a role as the first policy hire at Boom, which is a startup working on supersonics, and spent 2.5 years at Boom building the policy team and, working with FAA, managed to change their interpretation of policy towards supersonics, worked with Congress, managed to pass a very progressive supersonic agenda in the 2018 FAA reauthorization, a lot of work with KO and the UN. I left Boom in 2019 and joined the Center for Growth and Opportunity about a year ago. It's a research center at Utah State University, and working at CGO has been amazing. They basically let me delve into a lot of these topics that I'm interested in. And basically my goal is to figure out how to accelerate broad-based economic growth, right? And figure out how do we get these mainly non-IT technologies to come online faster through policy engagement and maybe to some extent cultural shift that values moving faster on these subjects.
Yeah. You mentioned Boom and supersonic flight. Just as an aside, why haven't we seen a replacement to the Concorde? It just seems really odd to kind of see something go backwards technologically. We had Concorde, the supersonic flight, and then it stopped and there's nothing to replace it. Why is that? Is it the noise issue, or was it just some kind of weird public fear around the way it got discontinued?
A bunch of things people don't realize. So first of all, Concorde was a little bit ahead of its time in terms of the market. Concorde retired in 2003. If you think about transoceanic premium business travel, it has more than doubled, right? So business class and first class has more than doubled in that period. And if Concorde were operating today, I think the business case would have closed for Concorde. But given that it was so early, the business case didn't really close. There were only 14 Concordes that ever saw service. The problem when you're running a fleet of 14 airplanes is maintenance. You never get the scale and spare parts and so on. Of course, we've had efficiency improvements, big efficiency improvements since Concorde. Concorde was designed on slide rules, like on paper. Like no computational fluid dynamics whatsoever. Like they would do wind tunnel tests that would take 6 months to get all the data back and analyze it. So, and like today with computational fluid dynamics, like you do that like in an afternoon. So we could do a lot better. The barriers have been things like in 1973, the US banned supersonic flight over land. So you could fly Concorde like supersonic over the ocean, but then you had to slow down and then come to an airport on the coast and so on. And that really cut off like sort of the natural entry point for a lot of the supersonic market, which initially it probably would have been business jets, right? And for business jets, more so than airliners, they fly more of their miles over land rather than over the ocean. So it basically killed the supersonic business jet market, and it created a lot of lack of investment in supersonics, on the other sort of technologies that you need to make supersonics really thrive.
Okay, yeah. I can see that there could be a lot more to talk about that subject, so I don't want to completely get dominated by that, but I can see your point. But let's jump into the recent post that you put out and the themes around that. So if we kind of just go through the main areas of new technology, let's start with biotech and health. Obviously, 2020 and coming into this year, we've had these major breakthroughs in vaccines, mRNA sort of technology. So that seems to me as an outsider as a huge breakthrough. So maybe let's start with that and get your sense on how big this is and what it means for the next 5-10 years.
Yeah, mRNA I think is potentially huge, right? Basically, it's technology that enables us to send a payload into your cells. Basically you send the mRNA instructions like to the ribosome in the cell, and your ribosomes produce proteins from that messenger RNA. But we can tell your ribosomes like what proteins to produce. And that can be, whatever you want, right? In the case of the coronavirus vaccines, what you're doing is you are saying to the cells, produce this spike protein, which is universal to all the COVID viruses, because your body has produced these spike proteins that it starts to figure out, here's how I'm going to respond to the spike protein every time I see it, right? Here's the immune response. And so you're training your immune system to be reactive against a protein that exists on the coronavirus that you made yourself, right? So like we're teaching cells to make the proteins that we want them to make. And then that has so many applications. Of course, it could be used against other viruses. I think it's really interesting that there are HIV vaccines that are in development using this exact same technology, and that HIV may be a little bit harder of an opponent than coronavirus, but I think is very promising. And then, of course, it's not just viruses. I think, if you can make proteins in general, you can use it against things like cancer. And so the mRNA vaccine companies are in fact working on cancer treatments where they sort of take the healthy cell DNA, they take the cancer cell DNA, they figure out what's the difference between them. They use that to figure out, well, what proteins, what can we target on the cancer cells? And it doesn't always work, but when it works, it's beautiful. The people they've tested it on are like, I'm seeing that like my melanoma recede.
And this technology, for example, targeting HIV, targeting cancer, that is something that we could see implemented broadly in the next, say, 5 years, say, or something like that.
On HIV, right, the issue is running trials and how long are we going to take to run these trials? So to be clear, like this seems like a very safe platform, right? And if you look at the COVID vaccines, like I quoted a reporter who said, none of the scientists I talked to had any doubt that the mRNA vaccines for COVID would be safe and effective, right? And so we're spending a lot of time on trials to make sure that these are safe and effective. So it's really just, I think, a question of how quickly can we get through those? And of course, the reason we got through them relatively quickly and sort of the trials that we did in the US is that there was this huge epidemic, and it was very easy to tell if the vaccine was safe and effective, or if it was effective anyway. And so that may be harder if we're sort of doing business as usual with the HIV vaccine. But if you could speed it along, yeah, I think, it very much could enter the market in the first half of this decade.
And, another sort of technology that I guess has been around for a bit longer has been all the Crispr gene editing sort of technology and science. And when it got sort of discovered or created, however you want to term it came with a lot of fanfare, and there was all these kind of expectations of cloning and mutant creatures and so on, and it's kind of seems to have kind of fizzled out from at least the popular imagination as an outsider again. I mean, where are we on CRISPR?
Well, CRISPR has, I think, revolutionized a lot of science, a lot of biology, Like a lot of labs are using it as a tool in their research. And so that's not a small thing, but it's not as big as the full potential of CRISPR, right? And the full potential of CRISPR is actually applying it in treatment, in therapeutics, to a range of diseases. I think that, the first ones will be the things that you really can't fix any other way, things where there is a genetic defect. You could use CRISPR to address that in a therapeutic way. And what we've had is just progress along the way to making therapeutics with CRISPR, but not final approval of any CRISPR treatment. It was discovered, over 8 years ago. We had a Nobel Prize awarded for CRISPR, but it still hasn't hit medicine. It's hit research, but it hasn't hit medicine. And, I think we could start to see some cures coming out, actually in the next couple of years. I think we'll have some approved CRISPR treatments. And, over the course of the decade, hopefully more. But I think it's very important to distinguish between sort of, the conceptual breakthrough and the product being on the market and actually sort of affecting people's lives. And that CRISPR is a great example of that phenomenon where we've had the conceptual breakthrough. We can do amazing things with DNA in terms of editing DNA, but that hasn't really affected anybody's life yet.
Yeah. And then, last year we heard about AlphaFold, so we heard about all the various alphas related to games, whether it's chess or Go. But this seems to me as quite a big sort of breakthrough. So do you want to kind of talk a bit about what AlphaFold is and its significance?
Sure. Yeah. So AlphaFold is a program by DeepMind that is able to simulate protein folding. And so proteins are the fundamental thing about life, right? Like they are what makes you alive, is protein. I remember back to the Human Genome Project, right? When they sequenced the genome, and you have I don't remember exactly, but Bill Clinton giving a speech about how we have unlocked the secret of all human life because we have sequenced one genome. And that's laughable now, right? So much more complex than that. What's actually going on is that your DNA has the ability to code for, hundreds of thousands of proteins, and it expresses different proteins at different times. And the collection of proteins that are in your body all the time, right, is the study of that is called proteomics. And the ability to understand how these proteins actually, we can know their amino acid sequences if you kind of stretch them out, but the way that they fold up and the way that they operate as, basically little machines inside your cells at such a small scale, that ability is what AlphaFold does. Is it makes it easier to understand that and to then be able to do things like target drugs, given the shape, the structure and function of these proteins as they sort of curve up according to the laws of physics. That enables, a much better targeting of those proteins. And over time, it will be a much stronger ability to control, essentially what's going on in the body.
Yeah. It seems quite revolutionary. I mean, it seems like, there was this kind of mystery of how we went from DNA to protein. It's very difficult to map the code to the final shape of the protein. But now we've got this breakthrough where we have some idea of how the mapping kind of works. And so presumably this gives us some control over biology, which we never had before. In terms of when this will come to market, so to speak, which is obviously a big focus for myself and our audience. I mean, is this a case of something for the 2020s, or is this something that's more for the 2030s that we need in the sort of 10 years for this to really to kind of see the results of it?
So I think probably more the latter, because, even if we are able to use this tool to identify promising drug candidates today, right? You still have to go through the clinical trials and all the usual process, not just clinical trials to sort of prove stuff to the regulators, but actually to prove it works to ourselves. So it accelerates one phase of drug discovery, essentially, the very first phase of identifying the promising molecules. So I think it's very positive. It doesn't accelerate the other phases that take a lot of time and cost billions of dollars.
Okay, so it sounds like the mRNA stuff is more immediate, is very exciting. CRISPR, we could see some breakthroughs in terms of therapeutics. AlphaFold might take a bit longer. Now, another thing that you've talked about is all of the life extension, longevity, work that's been going on. Obviously, this is a huge area amongst the Silicon Valley bros and all of those guys on the coast, blood transfusions and so on. Do you want to kind of talk a bit about some of the breakthroughs there and some of the things that could come to market?
Sure. Yeah, I think 2020 was a really big year for the Convoy lab at Berkeley, and this was the lab that that, back in a couple decades ago, like figured out about the mice. You could stitch their circulatory system together. If you had an old mouse and a young mouse and you just stitched their circulatory system together, the old mouse got younger and the young mouse got older, right? And that's what led to the blood boys and the sort of the crazy ideas about young blood. They published a couple very interesting papers this year on a different way of doing what seems to be the same thing, which is just it's not anything in the young blood that seems to be making the older mice get younger. Rather, it is harmful stuff in the old mouse blood. And so what they've figured out is you could dilute the plasma. And what they do is they basically take out essentially half the subject's blood plasma and replace it with saline, like salt water, and albumin, which is a protein that is part of plasma and that they take out. So they're basically replacing the albumin that they take out, but otherwise putting back saline. And by doing that, they're able to basically get the same results that they got with this weird, freakish vampire sort of procedure of stitching together young and old mice. And so what's interesting about that to me, given the focus on like how quickly can this come to market, et cetera, is that this procedure of taking out blood plasma, replacing it with something else, that is already approved by FDA, other regulators, et cetera. It's used for a number of conditions. And so it's not approved for aging, right? Like I think you wouldn't be able to market this as an aging cure, but doctors can prescribe it. And by the way, like there are machines that you can buy for like couple $1,000 online that will do this for you. So it's not super complicated, and it is, from a regulatory perspective, it's super easy.
And what it does is it improves your quality of life as you get older. What's the expectation?
That's a great question. So the Convoy lab, they had two papers, and one of them showed that it rejuvenated germ tissues. So like the tissues that sort of like, are needed to replenish your cells and so on. It did that. And then they also showed there was some brain improvement, reduction in inflammation in sort of like neuronal tissues. So it's pretty broad-based. I think of it, you have an economics audience, right? I'm trained as an economist. I think about it in terms of multiple equilibria. The body is in one equilibria and it has like one equilibrium and it has this like high protein concentration, and you like remove a lot of that and it puts it into a different equilibrium and sort of potentially makes you able to have gene expression that is younger given the protein concentrations in the plasma. So I think it's super interesting. I think another thing that's really going on in the life extension world is people are coming up with better and better metrics of biological aging. So looking at things like, they call them clocks, right? Biological clock, or, so analyzing DNA and figuring out how much methylation there is, and how much molecules are changing in a particular way. Measuring that is very useful for coming up with sort of a metric of how biologically old is this subject. And then again, like proteomics, sort of like measuring gene expression and which proteins are actually being expressed by the subject. That is also a useful tool. So that is sort of a prerequisite for being able to target drugs or target treatments or do clinical trials to see if you're getting younger, right? And ultimately what we need is a regulator to sort of accept some class of biological clocks to be a target that can be, evaluated in a randomized controlled trial to say, this is making me younger.
Otherwise, it could take centuries, I'm guessing, if you went for the other route of waiting for someone to die and the other random part of the trial not dying.
Makes it a very expensive trial if you're having to give somebody a treatment and then wait 50 years to see if they get old or not. But then, the other interesting thing about these clocks is that they are available on the market. You can go online and buy a DNA methylation test that will tell you, biologically, how old are you? And they're not perfect, but you could imagine doing various interventions on yourself and see, do they work? And so I think there's definitely a group of people that are interested in self-experimentation and biohacking and so on that are going to have a field day. They're already pretty affordable, $300 or something like that.
And speaking about kind of affordable kind of tech, obviously there's been an explosion in all these health sensors in various devices. So, the Apple Watch, Fitbit, all of these sorts of things. Presumably, as these get more sophisticated, that should, I guess, have an impact on the health system. I'm guessing, at least primary care in terms of, at least some part of it. I mean, what are your thoughts there?
Yeah, the thing I always think about with the Apple Watch is they come out with a new one every year, and it always has a new health capability. Every year, every model, it's got something new, right? The latest one was blood oxygen a blood oxygen sensor. So it could tell you, if your blood oxygen level drops to, an unhealthy level or a level that indicates you might have COVID. As sensors get better, they will be adopted, I think, in this industry. And Apple in particular is really positioning themselves as a company would be a good steward of your health data, for example. They're not selling your data to other people. They're one of the few tech companies that explicitly refuses to engage in that sort of behavior. Think about fast forward 10 years, right? That's 10 new Apple Watch releases. That's probably 10 new, at least, health capabilities they're able to do. And when you add that all up and sort of have continuous monitoring, you can imagine pretty sophisticated understanding of your body's state at any given time that may be better than the understanding that your doctor gets at your annual health checkup, right? What do they do at annual health checkups, right? They like listen to your lungs and your heart and, shake a stick at you. And, it's pretty minimal. And so you don't have to go that far until the Apple Watch actually provides a better understanding.
And, if we take that and all of the things that you mentioned so far in our conversation, I mean, do you think that taken together, these will be able to move the dial in terms of the health system for a country, like the US, say over the next 10 years, say? I mean, do you think it will make a dent or not?
Well, I think there's a lot of dysfunction, right, in the health system. And this doesn't cure the dysfunction, the way it's structured and so on. I think probably the biggest lever is the life extension technology, because what that actually does is over time, I think it compresses morbidity until you are very old. So you don't spend as many years of your life with the chronic illnesses of aging, which is where a lot of the medical expense is concentrated. And if you could sort of get to the point where, you live to your late 90s, like a year, like 6 months before you die, you start getting sick and then you die like 6 months later. Like that compresses a lot of the medical care into a relatively short period of time. And that's kind of how you could get sort of health costs under control. In the US, it's ridiculous. It's almost 18% of GDP.
Yeah, it's shockingly large. Yeah. I mean, the health system, it just really strikes me. It's a bit like the education system. You kind of think that, there's been so many advances in technology, yet why does the cost keep going up? I mean, why does it just feel so anachronistic and so bureaucratic and just not very dynamic? Obviously, there's a lot of politics involved as well, and, lobby groups and all the vested interests and so on, which makes the whole picture a lot more sort of complicated. But maybe let's kind of shift gear a bit. Let's think about the energy sector. There's a huge focus, obviously, at the moment about a shift to electric and environmental concerns, renewables, and so on. What's your thinking around that?
Well, I think it's great that we're finding new low carbon ways to produce electricity, right? And the past decade has been so impressive in terms of the cost reductions that we've seen in solar and wind. And so those cost reductions are not repeatable for another decade, right? You cannot have another, 90% plus decline in the cost of solar and wind. That won't happen. But what we are going to start to see, I think, is the deployment of those renewable technologies. And that is good from a carbon perspective. It's probably bad from a grid stability perspective. So this is, I think, something that people don't understand enough about electricity or the electricity grid, is that, it's got to be in complete supply demand balance every second of every day. And so the number of electrons going on the grid has to be the same as the number of electrons going off the grid all the time. And you do have, very sudden, unexpected variations in wind. Of course, during the day you have sun and at night you don't. Some days you have more sun than other days. And then I think another underappreciated thing about the grid is that you have to build transmission to support it, especially long distance transmission, especially if you're talking about renewables that have to be located in specific places. So, I think there's going to be a lot as we deploy more renewables. As much as I appreciate their low carbon potential, I think that it could create a little bit of instability of the same kind that we've seen in California in the past year as natural gas and coal come offline and as intermittent sources ramp up.
Is energy storage technology improving or not? Because obviously with some of these renewables, if you can store it, there's a Tesla storage units, where are we on that side? I mean, are those the sort of panacea for this? Or
So no, they have come along very impressively. There are continued improvements in the pipeline, but my view is that they will not in the next 10 or maybe even in the next 20 years reach the price that we need them to reach to be like the solution for the grid. In part, I think it's just because demand for batteries will be just so off the charts for electric vehicles, because we're going to also need batteries for electric vehicles, but they're still quite expensive and not really able to compete with things like natural gas, sort of the prices that are available there.
So what are the other energy sources we could have?
What you really need to solve this problem is a low carbon or zero carbon baseload energy. And the one I think is most promising is advanced geothermal. So most people think about geothermal as like, you can go somewhere near a volcano and you find exactly the right kind of rock formation and you inject water into it and you pull water out somewhere else and it's hot and you can use that to make electricity. And that's like the traditional geothermal industry. But what we're starting to see is a lot of this is because of the advances in drilling that we've seen in shale oil. But those advances in drilling make it more viable to engineer the subsurface to provide exactly the right kind of rock formations anywhere that you need. So you're engineering the subsurface. And then the other thing it enables, as drilling costs go down, it becomes more feasible to just go deeper. And if you go deep enough in the ground, anywhere on the planet, there is heat, right? So there's assuredly heat everywhere under your feet if you go deep enough. And so there are people coming out of the oil and gas industry who are very familiar with the drilling technology, or they're developing concepts for geothermal that could be done anywhere. All right. And I think the most advanced, the most promising in the long run, a version of this is a closed loop system where you circulate a fluid through a pipe down about 10 kilometers, if necessary. It gets hot, it comes back up, you extract the heat with a power plant at the surface, and then you send it back down. And so the fluid just circulates in a pipe, and you add heat at the bottom, take out heat at the top. And by being able to drill very deep and very cheaply, you can pull out electricity, potentially at very, very low prices.
And is this happening already in the US or in other countries?
Well, I'll say there are already startups that are drilling or planning to drill wells, maybe early this year to start doing some of these similar techniques. Probably no one's doing like just a pure closed loop yet, but this is all moving forward.
And what's the downside of geothermal? Presumably, is it the same issues as with shale, where you get complaints around the environmental impact and things like that?
Yeah, so there really is much lower downside than really just about anything. The sort of some of the engineered geothermal systems, the non-closed loop ones, the ones that don't use just a pipe circulating fluid, some of those do have some kinds of fracking involved with them, but it is different. It's generally it's not as much the kind that could induce seismicity. It's not polluting. It's a much cleaner form of it. And I think that's like part of their challenge is basically a problem of being like, yes, we are fracking, but actually fracking isn't what was wrong with the fracking that was done in natural gas. So that may be a little bit of a challenge, a public acceptability challenge around that. But, with the closed loop systems, there really is almost no downside. There's a couple barriers. One is improving the drilling technology, especially for high temperature drilling. So this is something the oil and gas industry hasn't had to do because they don't go down to where it's 300 degrees Celsius. And then the other issue that remains is a permitting one. So in the US, a lot of this exploration and drilling in the oil and gas industry is on public lands. And for oil and gas, there's a very expedited permitting process. And for geothermal, you want to drill the exact same well, it takes years. So that's a sort of a policy factor that needs to be fixed. But I think once that does get fixed, there'll be a lot of learning by doing, a lot of progress in the technology that will move things forward pretty quickly.
And then how about nuclear fusion? I remember back when I was at university in the 90s, there was talked about as the next big thing. And every sort of 5 years it gets talked about. Is this still far away, or is there something going on there?
Well, it's close in one sense. There are a bunch of fusion startups right now. There are active fusion programs, I would even say first half of this decade, that will demonstrate energy positive, taking out more energy than they put in. So I think that will happen. I don't know that the price will be worth it. At least what's coming out in sort of the first generation, it might not be able to compete with the current energy market, which has changed a lot since we first started researching fusion reactors, right? So wind and solar and geothermal, we're talking about like 2 cents a kilowatt hour. And a lot of the fusion reactors will have very large capital costs to actually put into production. And I think there's a very open question about whether that will be worth it. And I do think, nuclear and fusion could be very promising in places where we don't have access to those technologies, such as on the moon. You're not going to be able to do a lot of those you could do solar, but you couldn't do a lot of other stuff.
I mean, there's other things we could talk about in the energy side, but let's move on to transport. What are the big technology trends on the transport side? Obviously, electric cars, I suppose, maybe we start with that. That's kind of the big thing that we're seeing.
So I'm very bullish on electric cars. I think that they're better than internal combustion engine cars. I think there was a lot of doubt that Tesla would succeed in its mission initially, just because the car business is hard. It's hard to manufacture something at scale. But in terms of the product, in terms of would you rather have an electric car or a combustion vehicle? Like the answer is like clearly you'd rather have an electric car. The maintenance costs are lower, there's fewer moving parts, the fuel costs are lower. It's actually more convenient if mainly you drive like to and from work. You never have to stop for gas. It's a zippier, like sort of more fun to drive experience. Like you get a lot of low end torque that lets you accelerate very quickly if that excites you. So I think just about everyone would rather have an electric car. And with all of the advances, that we've even had with smartphones that make electronic components a lot smaller, a lot better, and so on. Like the electric cars are smartphones on wheels, essentially. And a lot of that technology translates pretty directly. And they're just great vehicles. I think every car company is going to have to start producing them. And people will, over the course of the decade, I think, switch over to them pretty dramatically.
But what about like larger vehicles, like trucks or lorries, as we call them here in the UK? These much bigger, vehicles. Presumably electric isn't a particularly efficient way of operating those types of vehicles.
Yeah, so towing a heavy load uses a lot of power. And the battery storage to tow a load a very long distance, I think, just isn't going to be there for a while. And so, my hypothesis is that given that we need to decarbonize, all forms of transport, essentially, that hydrogen fuel cells would probably be the best fit for those vehicles. Hydrogen is much more energy dense than batteries are, and so you could have a truck that has at least the range, even under load, has the range of a diesel vehicle today.
Yeah, and what about on the aviation side? Because presumably they'll struggle with electric, I'm guessing.
So I think on the aviation side, I think probably the thing that will gradually shift and take over the whole jet fuel industry is sustainable alternative fuels. There's a lot of competing ideas about how you could make these, but in general, it's already possible and certified and so on to be able to make them out of various forms of alcohol. So you could have ethanol to jet fuel. There's a pathway that's approved to make fuel out of that. And then there's a bunch of different ways to make ethanol, right? And actually, it's pretty easy to make it on a chemical basis. It's pretty easy to make it out of atmospheric CO2. So you could just capture the atmospheric CO2, convert it to a range of alcohols that are in water. And then the tricky bit is separating the alcohols from the water without using too much energy. But if you can do that, you can upgrade the alcohols to essentially kerosene and put it in your jet engine, just as any other jet fuel. And then, you burn that, you put the carbon back in the atmosphere, but it was carbon that you took out of the atmosphere to begin with. And so over the life cycle of the fuel, it's a zero carbon solution. So that is, the company that I'm most excited about there is a company called Prometheus Fuels. When I was at Boom, I was their first customer. So I think I was the first person in the world to buy zero carbon jet fuel. And so their technology essentially for separating the alcohol from the water is what separates them. They have a nano membrane that only they know how to manufacture, and basically without using any significant energy input, they can separate those components.
That's really interesting. And how about on the space side? It seems like with Elon, it seems like we have made some quite big leaps in recent years.
Yeah, and the story for the next decade or beyond, I think, is SpaceX's Starship vehicle, which they're developing right now in Boca Chica, Texas, and it is just so far beyond in terms of capabilities of anything else that is currently in development anywhere else or has ever been in service anywhere else. It's a 150-ton to low Earth orbit vehicle. It's complete reusable, like both the space vehicle and the rocket booster are both reusable. It's made out of more inexpensive materials. It uses much cheaper fuel, it uses liquid methane instead of traditional rocket fuel. Elon is figuring, it's going to cost like $1.5 million to launch this thing at scale. And $1.5 million to launch 150 tons into orbit is 2 orders of magnitude cheaper than we can do today, even on Falcon 9, SpaceX's current workhorse vehicle. Even if you don't hit Elon's target, right? Like say, okay, only 20x reduction instead of 200x reduction in launch costs. It's still extremely significant. The other thing that's really interesting about Starship is that they are planning to do on-orbit refueling, which means that you don't get a reduction in payload capability just because you're going somewhere else in the solar system. So on a normal rocket, say you can launch 20 tons to orbit, well, that same rocket might only be able to launch 4 tons to Mars because of the extra fuel you need to get the extra delta V. So with Starship, you launch into orbit, you refuel again, and then you can go on your merry way to Mars with the same payload. So there's no payload reduction. So anyway, it's just an extraordinary set of capabilities. It's going to revolutionize access to the entire solar system, and it's hard to overstate how big of a change it's going to be for the space industry, I think.
Yeah, okay, that sounds really, really quite impressive. I didn't actually know much about the Starship. I'm going to have to look them up after this interview. Let's move on to the more traditional IT sector, which is where we kind of frame this as being the area where most people tend to focus. So what's the interesting things happening in that space?
Well, I think, again, it's something that's coming out of phones. Traditional computing has been like, okay, you have a central processor and you put it on a motherboard and you attach a graphics card and you put this all on a motherboard. What's happened instead in phones is they've combined that all into a system on a chip. So it's basically one chip that has all the components that you would need on a computer on it. It's just a higher level of integration, what we've had in the past. And that is making the leap now from phones to other kinds of devices. This is what Apple has done on their M1 platform for their own Apple Silicon for laptops. And it's getting just extraordinarily rave reviews. People love these machines. They're faster than machines that cost 2 or 3 times as much money built without that. And it's also being used other places as well, the sort of idea. So if you look at Tesla's self-driving computer, a full self-driving computer, which is perhaps a bit of an overstatement of the actual capabilities of the computer, at least right now, but it is a very, very impressively performing device. And it's because they're taking advantage, again, of the system on a chip idea. So I think you're going to see that idea extend a lot further in terms of application specific, maybe system on a chip for machine learning. So we're seeing this already, people developing custom silicon that specializes at one task, such as deep neural networks. It has the potential to sort of outpace, in an experiential sense, outpace Moore's law. Right. So you can actually experience, like, subjectively, in terms of like your computing speed, like you can experience more than double computing power every 18 months, as we saw with smartphone speeds. I kind of noticed this, I don't know, 5 or 6 years ago when like Apple's phones were getting, like 3 times faster every year. And it's like, well, that's faster than Moore's law. What's going on here? And it was, they're doing this deeper integration between all the components.
Okay, yeah. Obviously we've covered lots of sort of ground. I mean, maybe I could just ask you kind of a final question around the sort of the tech area. And this is something that many people in our audience are focused on, is the whole crypto space right now. Obviously, Bitcoin prices continue to like shoot higher, and there's all sorts of different views around this. Some people view this as just a bubble, others view this as a way to completely disrupt the global financial system, not just Bitcoin, but Ethereum and blockchain and so on. What are your kind of thoughts around the whole kind of crypto blockchain space?
Yeah, so personally, I'm an Ethereum bull and a Bitcoin bear in the long run. I think crypto needs to find a actual, like, at scale use case for it to succeed in the long run. And I think Ethereum's really focused on scaling, on adding capabilities that might lead to sort of day-to-day use retail payments ultimately, right? I think like the move to proof of stake in Ethereum is something that's like very important to watch sort of in the next 2 years. Are they able to migrate the sort of Ethereum 1 mainnet to the proof of stake system that they've just launched last month? And so if they're able to like complete that transition, Ethereum becomes a very, very interesting platform with sort of technological capabilities that are far ahead of where Bitcoin will be. Essentially, they're just moving faster than Bitcoin is. I've followed Bitcoin for quite some time. Since 2011, I think. I was following it very early, and was quite enamored with the idea of a decentralized payment system. And I think that the narrative has changed, right? On Bitcoin, it's no longer about payments. It's more about this sort of digital gold thing that wasn't in the original Satoshi white paper. So I think there's been a switch in sort of mission as people have sort of realized, oh wait, this is making me rich. This is great.
Yeah. I think there's nothing more alluring than getting made rich by buying an asset, whether it's fine wine, it's art, whatever it can be, that will kind of trump everything else. So, okay, cool. Okay. So what I like to do to sort of round things off, I like to ask some personal questions, of my guests. One thing I like to think a lot about is how I manage my information and research flow, because especially in today's era, we're just overwhelmed by information and we get the notifications everywhere telling us to open something. What's your sort of strategy? What's your approach for managing information?
I just try to find high quality sources. Signal to noise ratio, right? I just try to be very, very conscious of that. The sources that I get the most value out of are Twitter, where I try not to follow too many accounts. Curated it quite well. Blogs, and people don't use RSS anymore, right? Ever since Google Reader got killed off, but I still use it.
I do as well.
My view is like the nichier the blog, the better. Right. So the narrower, like the more obscure, the better. Subreddits, right? What's great about Reddit is you can find super nichey communities and just like lurk on them and just listen in on what they're saying, even if you don't want to participate. I read technical books, like even in areas like that I'm not trained in, right? And one of the things that I've found is there's a huge advantage with a book. You can go through it as slow as you need to. So being able to sort of like self-teach, give yourself almost like a graduate level education in whatever topic you want, I think is really valuable. And you can do that if you just like find the book that they're teaching this stuff in grad school and just buy it and read it slowly. Like you can read it very, very slowly if you need to, but just you can learn it. The other thing is like there's not really a substitute for actually talking to experts and just getting to know some of them and making friends and asking questions. And people are usually pretty happy to talk about their area of expertise. And so that's kind of how piecing all those things together, it's kind of how I learn about a topic.
Yeah, understood. And kind of on a related area, I mean, do you have any productivity hacks that work really well for you?
I don't know if I'm the most productive person in the world, but I always have multiple projects going at a time with different priorities, of course, and so on. And my sort of philosophy is I try, to the extent possible, I try not to struggle against myself to do them. So if I'm struggling to focus on one, I'll say, well, okay, it's time to just switch to another one, find the path of least resistance, and make sure that I am productive that day. What kills you is the days where you don't get anything done, right? And so make sure that you're always doing something, and if necessary, find the path of least resistance. That is different than struggling with material, right? Like sometimes you have to push through and so on, but you don't want to be fighting yourself. And so that's sort of my philosophy on it: is you don't want your cortex fighting with your limbic system. Try to align them as much as possible.
And kind of, you mentioned books earlier, but are there a book or some books that have really influenced you, at a personal level or in a work context?
Personally, the book that I think has made the biggest impact on me is a book called Finite and Infinite Games by James Carse. He was a professor at NYU. He actually died last year, I believe. And it's basically just a sort of a life philosophy book. And fundamentally, it's about openness, and it's about, sort of seeing the future as a world of possibility rather than as a rigid thing that you have to shape in a particular way. Just experience it with a lot of openness and, a curiosity about what will happen, rather than approaching it with the attitude of, it's really important to make sure that this thing doesn't go wrong.
Yeah, understood. No, I haven't heard of that book before, but I'll definitely add it to my list of books to read. I also know that you're a fan of TV shows as well and movies and things. Any recommendations? Anything good that you've seen recently?
So I'm watching The Expanse now, the new season of The Expanse. That's just phenomenal. Just such great world building. So I am grateful to Jeff Bezos for saving that from cancellation.
Okay, great. Okay, well, kind of on that note, it's really great sort of chatting to you. In the show notes, I'll add a link to your blog and also to your Twitter account. Presumably those are the two best places to find you.
Yeah, those are perfect.
Well, yeah, aside from that, it was great chatting to you, and I hope you have a sort of very good year, and I'll be following your work very closely.
Oh, thanks so much. It's been great chatting, and really appreciate you having me on.
Thanks for listening to this episode. Please subscribe to the podcast show on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Leave a rating and let other people know about the show. Also, sign up to become a subscriber to our research at macrohive.com. We'll be back soon, so tune in then.